She had heard the horror stories. Every woman there had heard them. What American soldiers did to prisoners. What happened to women. She had made her decision weeks earlier, quietly, without telling anyone. Whatever happened, she would fight back, until blood was drawn, hers or theirs. Then the soldiers came through the gate. The women froze. Some wept silently. Others stared at the ground. Nobody spoke. The soldiers said nothing. They motioned toward a long wooden building at the edge of the compound. Inside, walls, a roof, benches along both sides, rough-cut planks on simple frames, unfinished, splintered at the edges. They had been marching for 3 days. When they were finally told to sit, they sat. That was when it started. Relief lasted only a few minutes. The benches drove weight directly into tailbone and hip, on bodies that had been moving for days, half-starved, wearing coats never designed for this winter. They were waiting for the soldiers to make their move, and in the meantime, the bench was torturing them. Women shifted, rose, sat again. Some stood back up entirely. Then someone said it plainly. "Sits in tut way. Sitting hurts." A guard noticed. Young infantryman pulled from the line for rear area duty he hadn't expected. His German extended to commands and not much further, but he understood bodies. He watched the small, continuous adjustments that a body makes when there is no comfortable position. He walked to the nearest bench and pressed his own hand against the wood. He said nothing. He left. She watched the door. Her hands were on the edge of the plank. She had stopped breathing deeply, short, controlled breaths, the kind a person uses when they are ready to move fast. Around her, the other women waited in the same silence. He came back, 2 others with him. Between them, U.S. Army wool blankets, folded and straw gathered from somewhere nearby. They worked without announcing what they were doing. Blankets over the plank surfaces, straw pushed underneath where the frames allowed. One guard ran his hand along a particularly rough edge and spent several minutes smoothing it with a small tool from his jacket pocket. He did it carefully, the way a person does a thing when they intend to do it properly. When they finished, one of them gestured. "Sit." The women hesitated. One sat down. Her posture changed, measurably, if not dramatically. The difference was real. Others followed, slowly. Then, quietly, one woman leaned toward another. "It's a trap. They want us to feel safe." Nobody argued. They were Nachrichtenhelferinnen, Blitzmädel, the men had called them, lightning girls, named for the signal insignia on their uniforms. Telephone operators, radio clerks, switchboard women. They had spent the war close enough to the front to hear everything, the stories that circulated, what happened to women who were captured. They had routed those communications themselves. They sat on the bench, and they waited for the trap to close. That evening, the same question returned, but larger now. Nobody doubted that the Americans wanted something. The only disagreement was what? Some believed the soldiers were gathering information. Others suspected the real danger would emerge only after routines had been established and vigilance had faded. Every explanation sounded plausible. The difficulty was that each passing hour removed one possibility and replaced it with a more confusing one. Every time a soldier moved near the door, heads turned. Every time boots scraped on the floor, shoulders tensed. She hadn't taken her eyes off the entrance since they arrived. The night passed. Nothing happened. The following morning, a guard distributed wool blankets, 1 to each woman. No speech, no conditions, no requests. She held hers in her lap for nearly an hour without unfolding it. "They're preparing us for something," she finally said. Several others nodded. Cruelty made sense. Fear made sense. Kindness demanded explanation. 2 days later, a sergeant noticed she had no gloves. The next morning, a pair appeared beside where she worked. He placed them there and walked away before she could say anything. She stared at them for a long time. Then she looked around to see if anyone was watching. Then she picked them up. Each small gesture raised the same question, but louder. What are they waiting for? That evening, a rumor spread through the building. Someone claimed she had seen a list, names, women being called out one by one. Nobody knew where the story had started. Nobody could produce the list. Yet by nightfall, nearly everyone had heard some version of it. The atmosphere changed immediately. Women stopped sleeping. Every time footsteps approached the building, conversations died. Every time the door opened, hearts accelerated. She found herself counting. 1, 2, 3. How many names before mine? The next morning, the door opened. A soldier stepped inside carrying papers. Several women straightened instantly. Every woman in the room felt the same thought arrive at almost the same moment. The waiting was over. The soldier glanced around the room. room. Then he began reading names, not for interrogation, not for punishment, for medical examinations. Then the doctor arrived. He entered with a clipboard and a translator. She felt something close to relief. At last. Now they would find out where all of this had been leading. Now the purpose behind every blanket, every quiet consideration would finally become clear. The women watched him move from person to person. Hands, feet, frostbite checks. They watched carefully, waiting. When he reached one woman and saw the condition of her feet, he stopped. He called for bandages. He knelt down. The room went very still. Every woman in the room felt the same thought arrive at almost the same moment. The waiting was over. The doctor wrapped the bandages carefully. He stood up. He moved to the next woman. The room stayed still. He finished his examination. He said something to the translator. He picked up his clipboard and walked out. The door closed. Nobody spoke for a long time. They had been certain, completely, absolutely certain, that the examination would reveal something. Instead, it had revealed nothing except that one woman's feet needed treatment and had received it. That was all. That evening, an argument broke out. Not loudly, almost worse than loudly. One woman insisted the Americans were behaving exactly as they appeared. Another accused her of being naive. The exchange spread across the room in low voices. For weeks, everyone had agreed on the same reality. Now they no longer did. Some still waited for the hidden cruelty. Others had begun wondering whether the cruelty existed only in stories they had repeated for years. Nobody wanted to ask that question openly, because if the stories were wrong, what else might be wrong? By the second week, a different kind of tension had taken hold. The women were no longer asking when the expected mistreatment would begin. They were asking why it had not. One morning, a guard dropped his clipboard near a group of women. As he bent to retrieve it, 3 of them stepped backward simultaneously, automatic, unthinking. He gathered his papers and continued walking. Years later, she wrote about that moment. What stayed with her was not the guard's behavior, but her own. She had discovered that fear could become so deeply embedded that it moved the body before thought had a chance to intervene. Some continued insisting that patience was part of the strategy. A few began entertaining possibilities they would have dismissed immediately upon arrival. Those conversations rarely lasted long. Accepting that the stories had been exaggerated required confronting a much larger question. What else had been wrong? That question lingered long after the conversations ended. The war was still audible in the distance, artillery on some nights. The conflict that had consumed Europe continuing toward its conclusion, indifferent to what was happening inside the wooden building. Then a jacket appeared on her bunk, olive drab, too large, no explanation. She left it untouched for the rest of the day. She wore it the following morning, early, before the others were awake. Nobody commented. Several women noticed. Something had shifted, quietly, the way most permanent changes happen. She found that harder than the cold. When the camps dissolved and the women moved on, to larger facilities, eventually to a Germany that no longer existed in the form they had left it, they carried specific memories alongside the larger one. The surrender faded. The marches faded. Even the fear of the first hours gradually blurred. What remained were the details. The blanket, the repaired bench, the glove, the doctor who knelt down and then simply moved on. Decades later, in letters and interviews collected long after the war, the same words surfaced again and again. We thought it would be worse. They had spent weeks waiting for reality to confirm everything they already believed. Every blanket, every gesture, every examination had seemed like the moment the truth would finally arrive. Instead, reality forced them to question it. And once that process began, it never fully stopped. The Americans had not changed. The women had. They found it on a bench, in the cold, in a war that was almost over.